Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk. My name is Josef Mühlbauer. I'm a university assistant at the University of Graz. I'm also a scientific researcher at Empowerment for Peace. And today I'm deeply privileged and honored to be joined by Professor Omer Bartov, the renowned Samuel Pisser, Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. As a world-famous historian of genocide and Holocaust, Professor Bartov tries for decades now to understand some of our most difficult questions of our time. Professor Bartov recently initiated a crucial global discussion with his opinion piece in the New York Times titled "I'm a Genocide Scholar, I Know It When I See It." And in the subsequent interviews, like for example in Democracy Now!, Professor Bartov makes the accusation that the current situation in Gaza constitutes a genocide. Dear Professor Bartov, thank you very much that you followed my invitation for this Peace Talk.
Thanks very much for having me.
Let's begin with defining the threshold. Let's begin with the key terms and concepts. For example, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and also genocide. Let's define, why do you think the current situation in Gaza defines genocide? Because in your New York article, you stated clearly this is a genocide. So based on your expertise and based on the UN Genocide Convention, what specific actions and patterns and intent indicators can you observe, or did you observe since October the 7th? That led to the conclusion that, okay, this is a genocide. So let's begin from here.
Okay. So look, let me start by saying that I originally published an op-ed in the New York Times in early November 2023. And in that op-ed, I indicated that I believe that war crimes were already being committed. We have to remember that within a month of the beginning of IDF operations, about 10,000 people had died already. That I thought that there was clear evidence also of crimes against humanity, and that statements had been made by Israeli politicians and generals that had a clear expression of genocidal intent. But I was not persuaded that that was actually what was happening on the ground. I warned in that article that if these operations continued, then they could become genocide, that the conduct of the IDF could deteriorate into genocidal warfare. That was in November of 2023. By May of 2024, I became increasingly convinced that there was actually genocidal operations in Gaza, and I wrote about it for the first time in an article that came out in August of 2024 in The Guardian. So this article that came out now in mid-July in the New York Times built not only on what I'd seen and written already a year before, but also, of course, on what had happened since. So let me explain a little bit the sort of process of that. First of all, war crimes are severe breaches of the laws and customs of war. And the two most important elements in war crimes that we would look for, certainly in an operation such as in Gaza, is disproportionate use of munitions. That is, if you drop very large bombs on places where there are people who have been displaced upon your own orders because you think that among them or under them there are some operatives of your enemy, of Hamas in this case. If you kill a lot of civilians, if you use a very large bomb, that may be seen as disproportionate use of force and could be a war crime. A second type of war crime that we could attribute to what is happening in Gaza is forcible displacement. If you move a population from an area, and even if you tell them, look, we're moving you because this is going to become an area of operations for your own safety, please move. And then you move in and you destroy everything there so that they cannot come back, that can be seen as a war crime. It's forcible displacement and it's permanent, it's not temporary. Crimes against humanity would have to do both with forcible displacement, that appears also as crimes against humanity, with murder, with extermination, with torture. If you are killing large numbers of civilians, whoever they are, without any necessity to identify them or to say what the intent of killing them is, that may be a crime against humanity. And unlike war crimes, it could happen in times of war or peace. There's no necessity for it to happen in time of war. Ethnic cleansing is not well defined in international law. It's not part of international law. There was a ruling by the ICTY, the International Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, that defined it. What it means is that one ethnic group tries to remove another ethnic group from a territory that it wants for itself. And once that ethnic group is removed, usually violently, because people don't like leaving their homes and sometimes have no place to go, then once that group is gone, then you're no longer interested in it because it's gone to another place. But under international law, it would appear again under forcible displacement without the ethnic element. Now, genocide is separate from all of these. And for genocide, there is an independent UN convention from 1948, which came into force in 1951. And most countries in the world are signatories to that, including Austria, Germany, UK, France, the United States, and Israel, signatories to that. And the way you define genocide is that these are acts carried out with the intent to destroy a particular group, a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group, in whole or in part, as such. Now, that means that you're not killing people because you want to kill people, or you're not using other ways of violence against them just as individuals, but as members of the group. That is, your intent is to destroy the group, not necessarily to kill all members of that group. And if you can identify the overriding intent to do so, you could say that war crimes can also be part of genocide. That is, if the war crime is carried out under the general intent of destroying the group as such. For me, it became clear by May that what the IDF was engaged in was not an attempt to implement the official war goals as they were announced by the Israeli government, which was to destroy Hamas and to free the hostages. That instead, what the IDF was doing was implementing those statements that had been made, these kind of genocidal statements that had been made also immediately after October 7th, but could have been seen at the time as expressions of outrage rather than an actual plan. That is, that it was engaged in a widespread operation that was trying to make Gaza completely uninhabitable for its population, with the goal of removing the population from Gaza altogether. And because the population has no place to go to, the borders are closed, there are no states that will take Palestinians in, then this attempt at ethnic cleansing has become a genocidal operation. And the reason I reached that conclusion by May was that in May, the IDF moved into Rafah, in which about half of the population of the entire Gaza Strip, about 1 million people, were concentrated because they had been displaced many times. And the IDF told them to leave and move them to the Mawasi area, which is the beach area without any humanitarian infrastructure at all, into a massive tent city, and then proceeded to completely flatten Rafah, so that by August it no longer existed. And that was, for me, the final confirmation that what we saw was not only a realization of the statements made at the beginning of the war, but also a pattern of operations, which is seen by the International Court of Justice, by the ICJ, as another way to prove intent. So a pattern of operations whose goal was to make Gaza uninhabitable. Since then, and we can talk about it, there have been many, many more types of evidence to show that this is the actual goal of the Israeli government with its implementing tool, the IDF.
So you answered already my next question. What brought you that you changed your mind? I saw also an interview with you in Vienna at the Institute for Peace, International Institute for Peace, and from there on, I saw that you changed your rhetoric and mind. And my next question is in regard to is there any consensus among legal scholars, political scientists, among Holocaust and genocide scholars? So is there any debate going on if is this actually a genocide or crime against humanity or ethnic cleansing, or is there a consensus among all the scholars? What's your observation?
So that's something that I did touch on in the last op-ed in the New York Times on July 15th. I would say that between May of 2024 and the end of 2024, so in the second part of 2024, gradually a consensus was building up among scholars of genocide and scholars of international law. Not everyone, but a growing consensus among those groups that what we were seeing was genocide. And many of these people are very cautious in using the term genocide. The reason is that genocide is defined, of course, by the convention. And what one needs to do is to see whether what you see on the ground conforms to the definition. But genocide is also used more widely by the public and by also academics at times, more as an expression of outrage. When you see large numbers of people being killed, especially if they're innocent, if they're civilians, then you say this must be genocide. And so there is caution among people who actually practice the study of genocide to not attribute this term before they can clearly see sufficient evidence that that is what's going on. The second thing is that there's a tendency among many people, not least among Jews and in Israel, to say that if what is happening doesn't look like genocide, it doesn't look like the Holocaust, it can't be a genocide. So if a genocide is taking place, but there's no extermination camps, there's no shooting pits, so it's not Auschwitz, it's not Babi Yar, then it can't be a genocide. But of course, that's not the way to define genocide. The UN definition of genocide, the convention, does not say it has to look like the Holocaust, it has to look like the definition. So that consensus is built over time, and I'd say that by now, there is a consensus. However, that does not include most Holocaust scholars, and to the best of my opinion, it doesn't include any of the institutions that are dedicated to commemorating and researching the Holocaust. Most of them have remained silent, have said nothing. Some, very few, including myself, and you mentioned earlier Amos Goldberg, some Holocaust scholars have actually said this is genocide. Some Holocaust scholars have come out and claimed that those who say that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide are anti-Semitic. So have attributed the sort of the worst kind of sentiments to those who are trying carefully to adjudicate whether this is genocide or not. So the main rift that we see now is between genocide scholars and Holocaust scholars. And that rift, as I wrote in the New York Times, is not only an academic issue, it also has to do with the whole culture of commemoration, remembrance, public policy, politics of memory that has been created over the last few decades around the Holocaust, not only as a specific event, but as an event from which humanity can learn something, as something with universal lessons. And that I find quite troubling, that we have this rift between these two genocide scholars on the one hand and Holocaust scholars on the other.
Thank you for your analysis. So maybe we move to the intent a little bit later. because I wanted to mention that, for example, there were many open letters and many, for example, let's list some names: Samuel Lederman, Melanie O'Brien, Ugur, Umit Ungur, William Shabazz, Ras Segal, Martin Shaw, Amos Goldberg, Iva Vukovic, and many others. There were lawyers, 1,138 legal scholars and judges, or in or from or based in UK, signed an open letter in which they stated the following. First, genocide is being perpetrated in Gaza, or at a minimum there is a serious risk of genocide occurring. 880 scholars or practitioners of international law, conflict studies, or genocide studies warn of potential genocide. I believe it was in October 23, and the list goes on and on and on. So I believe there are many from the legal studies and Holocaust and genocide studies that are on your side, so to speak. And let's move on now to the question of the division among those scholars. As far as I observed, and I read a paper of Ras Segal and Luigi Daniele, both stated that they can see a division among, for example, the field of anti-Semitism studies, the field of Holocaust memorial institutions, the field of Holocaust studies on one hand, that are pretty quiet when it comes to condemning Israel's action and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we have legal scholars, we have political scientists, peace scholars, and of course genocide scholars on the other hand. So is my observation correct? Is there any division? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, this is exactly what I was saying now, and that's exactly what I was writing about in the New York Times. Yes, there is a division. Why is there a division? That's a more complicated question. So I'd say that for genocide scholars and legal scholars, the question is and should be, as based on objective observation, on the data that you have, on your experience in studying other genocides, in your experience in international law, to say, do we have enough evidence to show that there is intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza in whole or in part as such? That is the question. For Holocaust scholars, this becomes more complicated. And so the question is not only a question of fact, the question is also a question of, most importantly, I would say, the allegation that the state of Israel specifically is engaged in genocide. So I think for Holocaust scholars to say, for instance, that in Myanmar there was a genocide, or in Rwanda there was a genocide, that doesn't present too much of a difficulty, although there has been a sort of lingering tendency to speak about the Holocaust as unique. And of course, if the Holocaust is unique, then you can't compare it to other genocides. But to say that there were other genocides that occurred, I think the majority of Holocaust scholars would agree on that. The problem is when it's the state of Israel, because the state of Israel, after all, was created in the aftermath of the Holocaust, in the aftermath of the largest modern genocide in history. And in many ways, the establishment of the state received international support in large part because of that, because of what happened to the Jews. There was a sense that now the Jews must have a state of their own where they would be able to protect themselves. They'd have their own government, police, army, and they would no longer be a threatened minority. And so to come today, 8 decades later, and to say Israel is engaged in genocide appears to many Holocaust scholars and to most Israelis as scandalous. How is it possible that you would say that about Israel? And I sort of agree that it's scandalous. But what is scandalous, of course, is not saying it, but doing it. That is, that's what the state is actually engaged in. But I think it creates a huge dilemma. And as I hinted before, one problem is this, that institutes dedicated to commemorating the Holocaust argued that if you commemorate the Holocaust, if you research it, if you remember it, it's not only that you're talking about the specific genocide of the Jews, there are lessons to be drawn from that. And the main lesson is never again, that something like this should never happen again. If you say that today, while at the same time not being able to say that here, this is happening right now, and you say, no, 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 we can't talk about that, then you're dismantling the whole notion that the Holocaust is an event that everyone should know, everyone should understand, is a warning never to do anything like that again. Now, obviously, there were many genocides after the Holocaust. It's not that the never again slogans actually were effective, but at least you could believe that those who study the Holocaust, who commemorate it, would condemn those events and say, we have to remember the lessons of the Holocaust. If you deny what is happening now in Israel, or if you keep mum, if you say nothing, then you're undermining your own position as not being simply someone who wants to remember the genocide of the Jews, but someone who is providing the world with a larger message. And you are retreating, as I wrote in my article, into a kind of, the kind of ethnic ghetto the Jews were in at the end of World War II, when initially scholarship on the Holocaust and remembrance of the Holocaust was only among Jews, and nobody else really was interested in that. And it took decades to universalize that message, and now that universal message is being undermined by the silence.
Thank you for your analysis. The point that I was making earlier, I misquoted. It was Shira Klein from January 2025. She wrote a paper, "The Growing Rift Between Holocaust Scholars Over Israel-Palestine." That was the. But I believe Ras Segal also wrote about that, but I'm not sure. Anyways, I just wanted to be correctly cited. So you also answered now my question about the problematic definition and the problematic, findings of intent, because not every time one must say it openly what is his intent in order to be, a crime against humanity or genocide. Also, the famous genocide scholar Amos Goldberg wrote about that. He also came to the conclusion, as you, that Israel's action constitutes genocide. And he wrote a paper, "The Problematic Return of Intent." So there he elaborates why is it so difficult to find it. And in the same article, he stated that there are more than 500 documented cases until January 2024. Some of them even in prime time television in Israel. So we have a lot of statements. Now the problem is, for example, what I'm asking myself, what if the intent is not so clear? For example, okay, what if Israel is trying to clear the territory of Gaza for Israeli settlers? Is it just a ethnic cleansing, but not a genocide? So where is the defined, why is it, in your opinion, a genocide? Because it is such a strong accusation. Not that I'm not, advocating for ethnic cleansing, to be clear, but maybe we can move to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure. So look, first of all, on the question of intent in general, most regimes and organizations that carry out genocide don't say that they are doing genocide. They don't publicize that. They say something else. They say we're acting in self-defense. They say we were attacked and we had to respond. They say the people on the other side are just animals and we have no choice but to destroy them. So they say all kinds of other things. They don't say that it's genocide. That's why it's often difficult to determine genocide. And that's why the International Court of Justice added to that that you can deduce an intent from a pattern of operations. If you can see that despite maybe formal denials, there is a pattern of operations that shows an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part as such, that may suffice. But in the case of Israel, as Amos Goldberg wrote, and as I wrote, and many others, there were actually statements, and there have been many, many statements. They started on October 7th, and you can hear them to this very day. And so there is no problem of finding statements by not just all kinds of talking heads on the media, but also people with executive authority. And there is a pattern of operations that you can also, from which you can deduce that intent is being implemented. Now to the question of ethnic cleansing. So first of all, ethnic cleansing, of course, is a crime. As we said, it doesn't come as ethnic cleansing, but forcible displacement is a war crime and a crime against humanity, neither of which is good. I mean, you should go to jail for war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's not something that you can say, well, it's not genocide, so it's okay. It isn't okay. And in fact, both Prime Minister Netanyahu and his former Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, have arrest warrants on their heads from the International Criminal Court, from the ICC, for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including using starvation as a tool of war, which is a war crime, forcible displacement, and murder, as well as torture. And so these are very serious crimes. Now, why do I think that it's not just ethnic cleansing, but also genocide? Well, I think that because if you look historically, you will find the most genocides that occurred in the 20th century began as ethnic cleansing. The first genocide of the 20th century, the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples by Imperial Germany in 1904, began as an attempt to just evict them from their territories. But they were evicted into the desert where most of them died. And that was facilitated by the German military. The genocide of the Armenians began as an attempt by the Ottoman Empire to remove the Armenians from the heartland of the empire, from eastern Turkey. And people were taken on vast tracts in which many of them died, and then into deserts again in which many of them died. So it started as ethnic cleansing. And in fact, the Holocaust began as an attempt by the German government to be rid of its Jewish citizens. Not to kill them, to just deport them, to force them to leave. And it was only because it took over more and more territories in which there were more and more Jews who had fewer and fewer places to go to that it resorted from an attempt to just remove them to Madagascar or wherever, to southern Poland. All kinds of ideas came up. Eventually, there was no place to move them to, and then they were killed. So there is a clear connection between ethnic cleansing and genocide. And what is happening in Gaza is precisely that. Yes, I think that what the Israeli government would like to see, Netanyahu and his far-right coalition partners, they now want the Palestinians to leave. And Netanyahu in May this year said, we are destroying their homes. They won't be able to come back to their homes. They're concentrated in the south. Our only problem is to find countries that will take them in. So that sounds like ethnic cleansing. But there are no countries that will take them in. And meanwhile, they are dying in their hundreds every day from starvation because of IDF policy. This is policy. This is not starvation. It doesn't just happen. It's limiting the supplies of food because of, as the Physicians for Human Rights Israel, the NGO Physician for Human Rights, documented just last week in a very long document because of targeted destruction of all the medical care facilities in the Gaza Strip, not incidental, not because, as they claimed, there were Hamas people under the hospitals, but deliberate destruction of the entire medical system in Gaza, which combined with limiting of food supplies leads to not only a high death rate, but long-term effects on the population. So all of this, when people cannot or will not leave, and people also don't want to leave their homes after all, often ethnic cleansing becomes genocide. And that is precisely what we are seeing in Gaza today, and we've been seeing it for over a year now.
Talking about the starvation and Israel's Ministry of Defense sponsored clips on YouTube, for example, where they put the blame on the United Nations, that the United Nations is not, distributing the food and aid and medicine and etc. So it's a blame game going on. So having said about propaganda that the other side is also always the bad, they are the bad guys, we're the good ones. We had the propaganda of the beheaded babies, for example. Later it came out that this was an extradition and it was clear propaganda misused and so on and so forth. But there is the point of critics of yours, for example, such as Brad Stevens, who wrote also an article in the New York Times, I believe. He answered to your claim, and he argued, and many others did, the quantification problem. So, for example, he argued, we are strong, we have nukes, we have modern weapon systems. So if we would like to do a genocide, we would nuke them, we would bomb them, so why only 50, 60, 100,000, if we want to destroy them as a whole, we would do that. So it's in our capability. So here comes the quantification argument into the game. What is your answer to this kind of arguments about the quantification, about the, numbers game?
Right. Yeah, look, I mean, it's first of all, it's a bit, how should I put it? It's extraordinarily callous to say that maybe 60, more likely 100 or over 100,000 people have died in Gaza. The majority of them civilians, at least by now, at least 18,000 of them children. That's bad, but it's not, it's not genocide. If it were 1 million people, or maybe 500,000, that would be genocide. So first of all, just the moral callousness of even writing that on the pages of the New York Times strikes me as extraordinary without saying anything else about it. Secondly, with all due respect to Brett Stevens and others, they don't seem to have read the Genocide Convention. You need to read the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention does not say that you have to kill half of the people, half of the group, or a third of the group, or a quarter of the group, in order to say that it's genocide. That's not what the law says. What the law says is that you have to show that actions are taken with the intent to destroy the group. Those actions can be killing members of the group, right? That's number one. It can be causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, right? So we know that by now, maybe 150,000 people at least have been wounded. Gaza now has the highest ratio per capita of children missing limbs in the world, right? There have been many operations without any anesthesia because medical supplies are not coming in. All of this is, of course, mental harm to people alongside physical harm. In Section C, which is very important, of the Genocide Convention, it says deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Almost all the population of Gaza has been displaced. Almost all the population of Gaza has suffered from lack of medical assistance. Large numbers of people have died not because of direct military action, but because they cannot go to hospital, because there's no hospitals. If you have kidney disease, if you have heart disease, if you have any chronic condition, you may well die simply because the hospitals have been bombed out, right? So the conditions that are created there, the epidemics that are there, because there's no clean water, because Israel actually bombed all the water plants deliberately, not incidentally. And one other section, which is really important to remember, Section D speaks about imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, right? Now, we know that miscarriages in Gaza since October 7th have increased by 300% since October 7th. That 20% of babies born in Gaza are born either premature or underweight, and they cannot receive baby formula and they cannot receive any hospital assistance. We know that large numbers of women have died because they were pregnant and they could not receive sufficient food. They may get enough food to somehow survive, but not the kind of nutritious food they need when they're pregnant. And so there is actually even viability to say, place to say, that even this section applies to Israeli actions in Gaza. And we have to remember that on the first day, on October 7th, the Minister of Defense said publicly, they will have no food, they will have no water, they will have no power, they are human animals, and they will be treated as such. And that policy of depriving a population of food over time, as you know, Alex Deval, who is one of the most preeminent scholars of famine around the world, has spoken about. Famine is not something that occurs from one day to the next. It's a process. And this process was put in place by the Israeli authorities over time. Indeed, there was control of food coming into Gaza before October 7th. There were calorie counts of how much food should people in Gaza receive. So to claim that because we have not seen 500,000 people dead, and only when we see those 500,000, and he may well reach 500,000, by the way, in the long process, because of everything that I'm talking about, because of the disease, the mutilation, the fact that you have a generation of children, half of the population are children, who will never recover from the trauma of the war and from lack of proper food, even if they don't die, the effect that this will have on them. So to speak about this in these kind of terms, and without actually looking at the convention, I find personally somewhat scandalous, not only wrong, but really morally outrageous.
I totally get your point. Maybe to show the whole picture and to show the arguments of both sides. For example, IDF spokesmen, spokespersons always mostly stated that the IDF is one of the most moral military in the world, and that they argue that Hamas is hiding and using civilians as human shields. So what we can do. Hamas-led or controlled Ministry of Health, the IDF and other spokespersons do not believe the numbers. So and on the other hand, we have the epistemologist Zeina Jamaluddin, I hope I don't butcher their name, and colleagues. They studied the overlapping between 3 data sources, and they estimated also a number between 60 and 70,000 killed since October the 7th. And in a second study, demographer Michel Joulot and colleagues estimated, they did a study on the life expectancy. Also quite worth to mention, it's the forensic architecture team around Eyal Weizmann and the yeah, forensic architectures, they also stated about 90% of what agriculture and many other water and so on and so forth, and they showed the horrible pictures of destruction. So yeah, so on that side we have both arguments, and yeah, so that yeah, I just wanted to show the whole picture. So maybe we can move on to a more recent topic. Today, if I'm not mistaken, Israel approved the plan to take over Gaza City. The UN, meanwhile, warned that this military takeover could risk a catastrophic consequence. So, what is your assessment? What do you think about the recent developments?
Let me just say first something about this argument of human shields, because this is often said, or what could have the IDF done? It's being blamed, but it had to respond to what happened on October 7th. And look, I'll say the following. I do believe that the IDF had to respond after October 7th, and that the war goals, as they were articulated, that to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages were correct. And obviously, Hamas carried out war crimes, crimes against humanity, and there's nothing to condone its actions. And you could argue that this was a genocidal attack, especially if you link it to the Hamas Charter. But if the IDF wanted to do that, this was not the way to go about doing it. And claiming that there was no choice but to destroy Gaza entirely, but to carry out the genocidal campaign, is to argue the genocide can actually be defended. There are ways to justify war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And there are no ways to justify them. They're not justifiable. Even if you say that Hamas wanted to carry out genocide, it doesn't give you the right to carry out genocide. Technically, the idea that the only way to defeat Hamas is to destroy every building in Gaza is, of course, militarily and morally and legally wrong. It's not the way to destroy Hamas. What Israel could have done was to say to the population of Gaza, we are going to destroy Hamas and release our hostages. And after that, having liberated you too from the rule of Hamas, which is a murderous organization and a terrorist organization, we will help you build up Gaza again. But of course, that's not what the government wanted. What the government saw October 7th as, it saw it as an opportunity to finally rid itself of the population across the border in Gaza and move it elsewhere. And that links to your question as to what this plan is. So this plan is such a bad plan that even the chief of staff has publicly been cited as being opposed to. He will, of course, carry out the orders of the government, and the civilian authorities, but he's opposed to it. And he's opposed to it on a variety of levels. First of all, this will ensure the death of the remaining living hostages. There are about 20 hostages left, we think. And this operation, the reason the IDF has not gone into some parts of Gaza, about 25% of the territory, is because they believe the hostages are being held there. And if they move in, the hostages will die. Secondly, because the IDF is actually exhausted. There's been huge attrition. So reservists are not showing up because they've served for months and months, and they can't afford to go back. They're losing their families and their jobs. Regular soldiers have had a high rate of attrition. There is actually a growing rate of suicides among soldiers. And so he does not have enough manpower. And thirdly, because of course this will lead to an even larger death rate among the civilian population and make the humanitarian situation even worse. But most importantly, the question is what will happen then? Let's say the IDF takes over all of Gaza. At that point, all those 2 million people who are now crammed into 25% of the territory will be the responsibility of the IDF. It has to feed them. It has to provide them with basic humanitarian needs, medical needs, schooling, social care. It's the responsibility of the occupier to take care of the occupied civilian population. Is that feasible? No, it's not. Israel does not have the money, does not have the soldiers, does not have the capacity, and does not have the will to do that. So why are they doing it? They're doing it because Netanyahu needs to continue the war. Most of this will not happen. The IDF said, yes, we'll surround Gaza slowly. It'll take maybe 2 months. And clearing Gaza will take maybe 2 years. What Netanyahu is doing is biding his time. He's waiting for the elections or waiting to postpone the elections. His main goal is, first of all, to stay in power, and the rest can go to hell. So it's not a viable plan. It's simply a way to extend the war, because as long as the war goes on, Netanyahu stays in power.
So I want to here also show the whole picture. So some are arguing that the goal is bringing back the hostages, demilitarize Gaza, and destroy Hamas. This is the official IDF position, I believe. Israeli settlers and leaders like Daniela Weiss, for example, stated that Israeli settlers should inhabit and live in Gaza, and instead of Palestinian, of course. Others, critics like Gideon Levy and many others, such as you, for example, stated that Netanyahu has an interest in these endless wars because he's afraid to lose elections, and he's also afraid of the corruption charges. So, yeah, these are also the whole spectrum of arguments. So let me move on to my last question, and it's a huge topic. Given your conclusion and given the South Africa case, which of course is pending, but we will see, what is your assessment of the international community's response? So, you know, arms delivery, arms transfer, political support, failure to impose meaningful consequences on Netanyahu and his cabinet, and what about international law? Is it obsolete? And what should states, you know, do in order to implement the Genocide Convention and to hold up, you know, the values of the international legal system and law? What is your opinion on that?
Look, the international response has been dismal. It's unprecedented to the extent that Israel, unlike Somalia or Russia or China or Myanmar, Israel is allied with European nations, with the most powerful states in Europe and with the United States. It's receiving massive supplies of munitions from the United States and Germany in particular, but also from other European countries. It is receiving huge assistance economically from the United States. Its biggest trading partner is the EU. It's receiving science funds, vast science funds. So it's not only that European countries and the United States have not acted to stop what Israel is doing, they continue to support it in doing it. And what I find especially scandalous is that certainly the United States can stop it and could have stopped it long ago. President Biden could have acted in November or December of 2023. Israel cannot continue operating without a constant flow of arms, especially from the United States and from Germany. Now, the German chancellor just said that Germany will not supply arms to Israel in this operation, but we'll have to live and see whether they do it or not, because a lot of this is sort of going under the radar. But the IDF cannot operate for more than 2-3 weeks without constant supply, especially from the United States. So, and of course, the US gives Israel a diplomatic cover. because otherwise the Security Council could have passed a resolution that this war must end, and if Israel does not abide by it, then there will be an embargo on it. There will be sanctions, but he can't do it because of the U.S. veto power in the Security Council. So all these countries are first of all complicit in what's going on, and one has to face up to that. But that's complicity not only in allowing Israel to continue the destruction of Gaza, it's also complicity, unfortunately, in dismantling the entire regime of international law. And these are the countries that have always presented themselves as the main protectors of human rights and international law. And indeed, they were those that created this whole system. And now their own ally, what in Israel was called the villa in the jungle, the sort of outpost of democracy and human rights in the Middle East, is carrying out massive war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and it's getting a carte blanche from Europe and from the United States. That's a disaster. The sooner something happens, the better. We have to remember the US now has also sanctioned not Israel, but the ICC instead, because it took out arrest warrants. This is destroying the system. And if Israel can get away with it, then why would other rogue states not do the same and say, you let Israel do it, why shouldn't we? We also want to be rid of populations in our own countries that we don't like. We want to kill them, ethnically cleanse them, and so forth. So yes, it is, I would say, a very urgent moment for these countries to finally stand up and start doing something. The second thing that they can do and have started talking about, but it won't have an immediate effect, is to speak about a political process. Because while what's happening in Gaza has to stop, rather than get even worse, there needs to be a political horizon. And a political horizon for that is, first of all, recognizing the right of Palestinians to self-determination and realizing that the root of the problem is the occupation, and that occupation has to end. Without that, such wars and such destruction will come again and again, even if we stop this one.
Absolutely, because we are running out of time here, I also wanted to show maybe the whole picture of all arguments. For example, in one interview, you stated that Israeli society is also complicit. On the other hand, we saw now recently, 3 days ago, over 500 former officials of Israeli Mossad, of Shin Bet agencies, of the highest ranks of diplomatic corps, call an end of this war, and they criticized the Netanyahu government. British Foreign Minister David Lammy said he's sickened by Israeli targeting and starving Palestinians, and he called for sanctions. And also he quoted that 80% of Israeli wanted a ceasefire and bring back the hostages. On the other hand, we saw the UK joined 27 other countries, including Australia, Canada, and France, in condemning Israel for depriving Palestinians of human dignity and urging Israeli government to lift restrictions on the flow of aid, and so on and so forth. And maybe this is for a next interview when you have more time. It's interesting because I'm sitting now in Austria. I'm an Austrian citizen, and Germany and Austria vetoed not only the UN resolution on ceasefire in Gaza. Germany and Israel were the two countries that blocked also the efforts in reopening the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which also so I'm very curious what Austria and Germany, because we have a burden and we have some history, you know it better than everybody. Because we learned from history, we tried to understand history and we tried to make it better. Maybe, okay, I'll leave it there, but I'm curious what you have to say about the German and Austrian position, never again. But that's for and the Staatsräson, but raison d'etat, but that's for another interview. Dear Professor Bartov, I wish you all the best, and hope we see soon a ceasefire, and hope the hostages are coming back, and there will be a peaceful solution, and thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. It was a great honor.